We have done the impossible more than once. We have pulled DNA out of a Neanderthal who died 40,000 years ago in a cold European cave. We have sequenced the entire genome of a woolly mammoth frozen into the Siberian permafrost. We have read the genetic code of a man who lived in Egypt nearly 5,000 years ago, recovered his ancestry tooth by tooth, and traced where his bloodline came from. Scientists today can take a fragment of bone smaller than your fingernail and reconstruct the face, the diseases, the migrations, and the family tree of a person who has been dead since before the pyramids were built. And yet, with all of that power, with all of that technology, there is one ancient people that the entire field of genetics has never been able to touch. The people who invented writing, the people who built the first cities on Earth, the people who gave us the wheel, the law, the school, and the very idea of civilization itself. The Sumerians. Not a single complete Sumerian genome has ever been sequenced, not one. And when researchers finally went looking for the genetic ghosts of the Sumerians inside the bodies of the people living in Iraq today, what they found was not what anyone expected. It quietly overturned a theory that historians had believed for over 100 years, and it raised a question that the more you sit with it, the more unsettling it becomes. To understand why this matters, you have to understand who the Sumerians actually were, because most people have never even heard their name. Around 6,000 years ago, in the flat, hot, river-soaked land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in the southern part of what is now Iraq, something happened that had never happened anywhere on the planet before. Human beings stopped simply surviving and started building. They drained the marshes. They dug canals. They learned to control the floods and force the desert to grow grain. And out of that grain, out of that surplus, out of that first taste of having more than they needed, they built cities. Real cities with tens of thousands of people, with temples that rose like artificial mountains, with kings and priests and tax collectors and brewers and bureaucrats. They called their land Sumer. And in those cities, they did the single most important thing in the history of our species. They pressed a reed into wet clay and invented writing. Everything you have ever read, every contract you have ever signed, every message on your phone, every word of every book, traces back in an unbroken line to a Sumerian accountant trying to keep track of how many sheep belonged to the temple. They gave us the first written laws, the first written poetry, the first recorded story of a great flood, written down more than 1,000 years before the Bible. They divided the hour into 60 minutes and the circle into 360 degrees, and you still live by their math every single day. They built the first schools, where children sat in rows and complained about their teachers in words we can still read today. And when archaeologists opened the royal tombs of the city of Ur, they did not find the graves of savages. They found kings and queens buried in golden headdresses, surrounded by harps inlaid with lapis lazuli, attended in death by rows of servants and soldiers and musicians who had gone with them into the ground. They found craftsmanship so fine, so delicate, so advanced, that when the treasures were first pulled from the earth in the 1920s, the world refused to believe they were 5,000 years old. These were not primitive people. These were the people who switched the lights on for the entire human race. And then they vanished. Not in a war, not in a single catastrophe, but slowly, the way a language dies. Their tongue, Sumerian, was a strange and lonely language. It is what linguists call a language isolate, which means it is related to nothing. Not to Arabic, not to Hebrew, not to Persian, not to any language spoken today, or any language we have ever found in the ground. It stands completely alone, with no parents and no children, like a single survivor of a world that has otherwise disappeared entirely. Over time, Sumer was absorbed. Other peoples moved in. The Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and Sumerian faded from the streets and survived only as a holy language in the temples, the way Latin survived in the church long after Rome had fallen. And then even that faded. By 2,000 years ago, no human being on earth could speak Sumerian. The cities turned to mounds of mud. The writing turned into meaningless scratches that nobody could read. And the people who had invented civilization were so completely forgotten that, until the 1800s, the modern world did not even know they had ever existed. We found them by accident, buried under the sand, hidden inside clay tablets we could not yet decode. And the very first question every scholar asked, the question that has haunted this field for a century and a half, was simple. Who were they? Where did these people come from? And just as importantly, where did they go? That question turned out to be far harder to answer than anyone imagined, and the reason comes down to a brutal accident of geography. To read someone's ancient DNA, you need their DNA to survive. And DNA is a fragile thing. It does not like heat. It does not like moisture. It does not like time. The reason we have a Neanderthal genome is that the bodies sat in cold European caves, almost like a refrigerator, for tens of thousands of years. The reason we have a mammoth genome is that the animal was sealed in ice. But southern Iraq, the heartland of Sumer, is one of the worst places on the entire planet for preserving genetic material. It is blisteringly hot. The ground floods. The soil is heavy and wet and then baked dry over and over, season after season, for thousands of years. In those conditions, DNA does not last. It shatters into fragments too small to read, and then it dissolves into nothing. So while archaeologists have pulled tens of thousands of clay tablets out of the Sumerian cities, while they have recovered jewelry and statues and entire royal tombs filled with gold, the one thing they have almost never been able to recover is a readable Sumerian genome. The bodies are there, the bones are there, but the genetic code inside them has been erased by 6,000 years of Iraqi heat. The Sumerians left us their words, but they did not leave us their blood, at least not in a form we could easily read. And that is where this story takes its first strange turn. Because if you cannot read the DNA of the ancient Sumerians directly, there is only one other place you can look. You look at the people who never left. In the deep south of Iraq, where the Tigris and the Euphrates finally meet before emptying into the Gulf, there is a landscape unlike anywhere else in the Middle East. It is not desert. It is water. A vast green wilderness of reeds and shallow lakes and floating islands, a wetland the size of a small country sitting in the middle of one of the driest regions on Earth. And living in that water, for as long as anyone can remember, are a people called the Marsh Arabs, or in their own tongue, the Medan. They build their houses out of reeds, exactly the way the Sumerians did. They build them in the same shape, with the same arched roofs, using the same techniques, on the same artificial reed islands, in the same marshes, that appear in Sumerian art from 5,000 years ago. They herd water buffalo through the same channels. They fish and hunt and travel by canoe through a world that looks, in photographs, almost identical to the carved images on Sumerian temple walls. For a long time, scholars looked at these people and wondered the obvious thing. Could it be? Could the Marsh Arabs be the living descendants of the Sumerians, the last unbroken thread connecting the modern world back to the people who started it all? But there was a competing theory, and it was not a kind one. Many believed the Marsh Arabs were not ancient at all. They believed they were outsiders, a foreign group of unknown origin who had wandered into the marshes relatively recently, perhaps from India or from somewhere in South Asia, bringing their water buffalo with them. According to this view, the Marsh Arabs were strangers squatting in the ruins of a civilization that was never theirs. Two theories. One says they are the oldest people in Iraq. The other says they are the newest. And for decades, nobody could prove which one was true, until finally somebody decided to look inside their cells. In 2011, a team of researchers did something that had never been done properly before. They collected DNA from 143 Marsh Arabs, along with a large sample of other Iraqis to compare against, and they read their genetic code. Specifically, they looked at two things. They looked at the Y chromosome, which passes almost unchanged from father to son, generation after generation, tracing the direct male line back through deep time. And they looked at mitochondrial DNA, which passes from mother to child, tracing the direct female line. Together, these two markers act like a genetic surname for both sides of your family, a signal you carry from your most ancient ancestors, whether you know it or not. And when the results came back, they were clear, and they were stunning, and they pointed in one direction only. The Marsh Arabs were not foreigners. They were not migrants from India. They were not strangers who had wandered in from South Asia. Their genetic signature was overwhelmingly, prevalently local. It was Middle Eastern. It was Mesopotamian. The blood in their veins came from the land between the rivers, and it had been there for a very, very long time. The foreign theory, the idea that they were recent outsiders, collapsed. The contribution from South Asia turned out to be almost nothing, a faint whisper, barely detectable. The water buffalo had come from India. The rice farming had come from India, but the people had not. The culture had been imported. The blood was native. These were the people of Mesopotamia, and they had been the people of Mesopotamia since before anyone could remember. But the researchers found something even more specific, and this is the part that sends a chill down your spine when you really understand it. Buried inside the Y chromosome data of the Marsh Arabs was a particular genetic lineage, a specific branch of the human family tree that showed signs of a local expansion. A moment in deep history when this particular bloodline suddenly grew, multiplied, and spread across the region. And when the scientists calculated the timing of that expansion, when they ran the genetic clock backwards to see when this surge of population had happened, the date they landed on was almost exactly contemporary with the rise of the Sumerian city-states. Think about what that means. Hidden inside the DNA of people fishing in the Iraqi marshes today is the genetic echo of the exact moment civilization was born. The same population boom that filled the first cities, that built the first temples, that pressed the first words into clay, is still detectable, still readable, still alive in the bodies of their descendants 6,000 years later. The Sumerians did not vanish. They were never lost. They were standing in the water the entire time, waiting for us to learn how to see them. And the conclusion the researchers drew was the one that quietly rewrote the history books. If the Marsh Arabs are the descendants of the Sumerians, and the genetics strongly suggests they are, then the Sumerians themselves were local. They were native to Mesopotamia. They did not come from India. They did not come from South Asia. They did not come from outer space, as some of the wilder theories had whispered for years. They came from the mud and the reeds and the rivers of southern Iraq, and their children never left. Now here is where the story opens up into something much larger than one group of people in one marsh, because the Marsh Arabs were not the only ones carrying this ancient signal. When the researchers compared their DNA against other populations across Iraq, they found the same Mesopotamian thread running through all of them. The Assyrians, an ancient Christian people who still speak a language descended from the tongue of the Assyrian Empire, carried it. Iraqi Jews, whose presence in the region goes back to the Babylonian exile thousands of years ago, carried it. The Mandeans, a tiny and ancient religious community who still perform their rituals in the rivers of Iraq, carried it. Different religions, different languages, different histories, but underneath all of it, the same deep genetic foundation, the same Mesopotamian bedrock, the same blood of the land between the rivers. And this points to something that is almost philosophical in its weight. The empires of Mesopotamia rose and fell. Sumer gave way to Akkad. Akkad gave way to Babylon. Babylon gave way to Assyria. Assyria fell to the Persians. The Persians fell to the Greeks. The Greeks gave way to the Arabs. Conquerors came. Languages changed. Gods were replaced. Names were forgotten. But through all of it, through 5,000 years of war and collapse and conquest, the people themselves largely stayed. The faces changed their words and their prayers, but they did not change their ancestors. One 19th century scholar put it bluntly, long before we had the genetics to prove it. He said the Iraqi population was, without doubt, much the same in his day as it had been in the time of the Sumerians and the Babylonians and the Assyrians. He was guessing. He was looking at faces and customs and making an educated leap. But the DNA, when it finally came, said he was right. And then, just when this story seemed to have reached its conclusion, the science went deeper and it went stranger. Because the marshes only tell you about the very south. To understand the full picture of who these ancient people were, researchers needed older DNA, and they needed it from further north, from the wider Mesopotamian world. So they turned to the few places where ancient genetic material had actually survived. Sites on the northern edge of Mesopotamia where the climate was just slightly kinder to the dead. And there, in the bones of farmers who lived 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, right at the dawn of the Neolithic Revolution, when humanity was first learning to plant seeds and settle down, they finally recovered real ancient genomes. And what those genomes revealed was that the ancestry of Mesopotamia was never one single thing. It was a meeting place. It was a blend. These early people carried a mixture of two great streams of humanity, one flowing in from the west, from Anatolia and the lands around it, and one flowing in from the east, from the direction of the Iranian highlands. Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, was also a crossroads of civilization, a place where different ancient peoples met, mixed, and over thousands of years became something new. The Sumerians did not spring from nowhere. They were the product of the oldest melting pot on Earth, and the genetic continuity from those Neolithic farmers down through the ages shows a population that, even as it absorbed newcomers, never lost its core. The people stayed. The land kept its children. But the single most shocking discovery in this entire story did not come from Iraq at all. It came from Egypt, and it was published only recently in the summer of 2025. And it sent a quiet shockwave through the world of archaeology. For the first time ever, scientists managed to sequence a complete genome from an ancient Egyptian, a man who lived around 4,500 to nearly 5,000 years ago during the age of the Old Kingdom, the era when the Great Pyramids were being built. His body had been recovered from a rock-cut tomb over a century ago, sealed inside a ceramic pot, and against all odds, enough of his DNA had survived to read. And when they read it, they found something that no one had ever been able to prove before. Roughly 4/5 of his ancestry was exactly what you would expect, rooted in North Africa and the land of Egypt itself. But the remaining fifth, a full 20% of his genetic makeup, came from somewhere else entirely. It came from the east. It came from the Fertile Crescent. It came from Mesopotamia, the land of the Sumerians. Here was hard, undeniable, biological proof of something that historians had only ever been able to guess at. The two great cradles of human civilization, Egypt and Mesopotamia, the two places where writing and cities and kings first emerged at almost exactly the same moment in history, were not separate worlds. They were connected, not just by trade, not just by similar pottery and parallel inventions, but by blood. People had moved between them. Mesopotamian ancestry was flowing in the veins of an Egyptian man building monuments by the Nile, at the very same time that the Sumerians were pressing their final words into clay back in Iraq. The Nile and the Euphrates, it turned out, were not two separate stories. They were one story, with people walking back and forth across the bridge between them, carrying their genes, their ideas, and the spark of civilization itself. So now step back and look at the full shape of what the science actually found, because this is where the title of this story flips its meaning. People hear that researchers compared Sumerian and Iraqi DNA, and they expect a scandal, a horror, a dark secret, something that should never have been uncovered. But the truly unsettling thing is not some monstrous revelation. The truly unsettling thing is how intimate it is. The people who invented the wheel are not gone. The people who wrote the first poem are not gone. The people who built the first city and drew the first map of the heavens and split the hour into 60 minutes are not lying in some sealed vault of extinct humanity. They are alive. They are fishing in the marshes of southern Iraq. They are praying in Mandaean rituals by the riverbanks. They are scattered through the faces of ordinary Iraqis walking the streets of Basra and Baghdad, carrying in their cells a genetic signature that predates the pyramids, that predates the Bible, that reaches all the way back to the first morning of the civilized world. We searched for the Sumerians as if they were a lost tribe, a vanished people, a mystery buried in the sand. And the answer was that they never went anywhere at all. The mystery was not that they disappeared. The mystery is that they are still here, hiding in plain sight, and almost none of their descendants even know it. And that raises the question that lingers long after the data is done, the question that turns this from a story about science into a story about you. If a people this important, this foundational, this central to everything we are could be so completely forgotten that the entire modern world believed they had vanished from the face of the earth, when all along their descendants were standing right where they had always stood, then what does that say about how history actually works? It says that being remembered and being gone are two completely different things. The Sumerians were forgotten for 2,000 years, while their blood ran unbroken through 100 generations. They lost their name, but never lost their line. And somewhere out there, right now, there are people going about their ordinary lives, fishing, working, raising children in the same wet green corner of Iraq, who are the living end of the oldest, unbroken human story we have ever managed to trace. They are the last Sumerians. They have simply forgotten that they are. But there's one more turn to this story, and it is the darkest of all, because the living descendants of the world's first civilization very nearly did not survive into our century. In the 1990s, after an uprising in southern Iraq, the regime of the time made a deliberate decision to destroy the marshes themselves. They built enormous dikes and canals and drained the wetlands on purpose, draining the very water that the marsh Arabs had lived in for thousands of years, turning that green wilderness into a cracked and poisoned salt desert. The reeds died. The buffalo died. The fish vanished. A way of life that stretched in an unbroken line back to Sumer, that had survived every empire and every conqueror for 6,000 years, was nearly wiped out completely in the span of a single decade. Not by time, not by climate, but by human cruelty. Hundreds of thousands of people were driven from their homes. The oldest continuous human community on Earth came within a hair's breadth of vanishing for good, right at the end of the 20th century while the rest of the world barely noticed. And here is the part that should stop you cold. We came so close to losing them that we might have erased the last living thread back to the Sumerians without ever realizing what we were destroying. The DNA that finally proved who they were was collected from a people who had just survived an attempt to wipe them off the map. After the regime fell, some of the marshes were reflooded, some of the water came back, and some of the people returned to rebuild their reed houses on the old islands, exactly as their ancestors had done since the dawn of history. They are still there, they are still holding on, but they are holding the thinnest thread in all of human history, and most of the world still does not know that thread exists. The clay tablets gave us their words. The marshes gave us their bodies. And the DNA, at last, gave us the one thing we never expected to find at the end of this search. Not an ending at all. The continuation. Think about that the next time you check the time, because the 60 minutes in your hour are theirs. Think about it the next time you read a single written word, because the very act of writing is their invention, handed down to you across 6,000 years through an unbroken chain of human beings, ending in a people who are still alive, still fishing, still here. We did not find a lost civilization buried in the sand. We found that it never lost itself. It only lost its name. The first civilization on Earth never died. It just stopped telling its own name. And now, at long last, after 6,000 years of silence, the science has finally said it out loud.